The landing, an 11-year-old girl sits in the first officer's seat of a Boeing 737. She has 200 people behind her. The runway is straight ahead. Her hands are shaking. The radio tells her what to do. She brings the big airplane down perfectly. Everyone cheers. News channels around the world show her face. She becomes the youngest person to ever land a commercial jet. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Sophie Mitchell pressed her nose against the cool window of seat 12C, watching the ground crew load luggage into the belly of Southwest Flight 1134. She was small for 11, barely 4'8", and the purple leggings she wore made her legs look like colorful sticks dangling from the seat that seemed designed for someone twice her size. Her oversized hoodie, cream-colored with a sparkly cartoon unicorn across the front, bunched around her waist. Two messy braids framed a face that still carried the roundness of childhood, scattered with freckles that darkened every summer and faded every winter. Mr. Trunk sat in her lap, a stuffed elephant with one ear slightly more worn than the other, a remnant from when she was 3 and carried him everywhere by that specific ear. She'd tried to leave him at her aunt's house in Phoenix. "I'm 11, she told herself firmly. Too old for stuffed animals on planes. But at the last minute, she'd shoved him into her backpack with the glitter patches and rainbow keychain, and now here he was, squeezed between her hands as the final passengers filed past. The flight attendant, Michelle, according to her name tag, stopped beside row 12 with a practiced smile. "You doing okay, sweetie, first time flying alone?" Sophie nodded, the lie coming easily because it was simpler than the truth. She'd flown dozens of times, but never like this. Never as just a passenger. Never in the back while someone else controlled the aircraft. "Well, you're doing great," Michelle said, crouching down to be at eye level. "If you need anything at all, you just press this button right here, okay?" She demonstrated the call button. "And here's a little something for being so brave." She pinned a small plastic wings badge to Sophie's hoodie, right next to the unicorn. Sophie touched the wings gently. "Thank you. What are you reading?" Michelle gestured to the graphic novel in the seat pocket, something with dragons and warriors on the cover. "It's about a girl who has to save her kingdom," Sophie said quietly. "Nobody believes she can do it because she's young. But she's the only one who knows the ancient magic." Michelle smiled. "Sounds like a good one. Enjoy your flight, Han." After she moved on, the businessman in 12B glanced over his laptop screen. He was maybe 40, wearing a polo shirt with a company logo, already deep into a spreadsheet that glowed against his face. "That book any good?" he asked absently. "Yeah. It's about how people underestimate you when you're young. Even when you know things." He smiled vaguely, clearly not really listening. "That's nice." His attention returned to his screen. The woman in 12A, elderly, with silver hair in a neat bun, set down her knitting. "Is this your first time flying alone, dear?" Sophie nodded again. "Well, you're very brave. When I was your age, I would have been terrified." The woman's needles clicked softly. "Visiting family?" "Sort of, going back to Portland to get some of my things. I've been staying with my aunt." "Where are your parents?" The question landed like it always did, heavy, complicated. "My mom died when I was 4. My dad, he's in a rehabilitation facility. He had a stroke 2 weeks ago." The woman's face crumpled with sympathy. "Oh, sweetheart. I'm so sorry." Sophie hugged Mr. Trunk tighter. "He's getting better. The doctors say he'll recover most of his movement. It just takes time." "What does your father do?" "He's a pilot." The words came automatically, then Sophie added what she always added, a test pilot. "He flies experimental aircraft." "How exciting. I bet he's very brave." "You have no idea," Sophie thought. But she just smiled and opened her graphic novel, the universal signal that conversation time was over. As the plane pushed back from the gate and began its taxi to the runway, Sophie tried to force herself to relax. She was just a passenger today. Just a kid going from Phoenix to Portland, just Sophie. But her body wouldn't cooperate. Her ears tracked every sound, the hydraulics pressurizing, the flaps extending for takeoff, the subtle whine of the engine spooling up. When the thrust pushed her back into her seat during takeoff, her hands instinctively mimicked the rotation, pulling back on an invisible yoke at exactly 70 knots when the nose wheel lifted. "Stop it," she told herself fiercely. "You're not flying today. You're just a passenger." Except she'd never been just a passenger. Not really. Sophie's earliest memory wasn't of a birthday party or a holiday. It was of sitting in her father's lap in the cockpit of a Cessna 172, her tiny hands wrapped around the yoke while his much larger hands covered hers, guiding. She was 4, maybe 5, and she remembered the feeling of the aircraft responding to their combined input, the way the horizon tilted when they turned, the strange sensation in her stomach when they climbed. "Feel that, Soph," her father had said, his voice rumbling through his chest into her back. "That's the plane talking to you. She's telling you what she needs. You listening?" Sophie had nodded, mesmerized. Most pilots, they learn to fly with their eyes and their heads. But the best pilots? They fly with their hands. They feel it. You feel it, kiddo. She did feel it. Even then, she felt it. Jack Maverick Mitchell had earned his call sign not through recklessness but through an almost supernatural ability to control aircraft in situations that would have killed lesser pilots. He'd test-flown experimental military jets, corporate prototypes, concept aircraft that existed nowhere else on Earth. He understood flight the way poets understood language, intuitively, deeply, at a level that transcended mere technical knowledge. When Sophie's mother, Rebecca, died in a car accident when Sophie was 4, Jack threw himself into the only two things he had left, his work and his daughter. He noticed things about Sophie that other people didn't see. The way she could predict the trajectory of a thrown ball with uncanny accuracy. How she built elaborate structures with blocks that demonstrated an intuitive understanding of balance and weight distribution. The fact that when she drew pictures, her sense of perspective and spatial relationships was years ahead of her age. He took her to a pediatric neuropsychologist when she was 6, not because something was wrong but because he wanted to understand what was right. The results were remarkable. Sophie's spatial awareness, three-dimensional reasoning, and hand-eye coordination all tested in the 99.9th percentile. Her ability to make rapid calculations about speed, distance, and angles approached savant levels. "It's extraordinary," the neuropsychologist had told Jack. "She processes spatial information the way most people process language, effortlessly, naturally. This isn't learned. It's how her brain is wired." "What do I do with that?" Jack had asked. "Nurture it. Challenge it. Let her explore it." So Jack Mitchell made a decision that would change everything. He would teach his daughter to fly. Not as a game. Not as pretend. Really fly. He started with simulators he built in their garage, cobbled together from old flight instruments, computer screens, and software he modified himself. Sophie would sit in the simulator for hours, Jack beside her, teaching her the same way he'd been taught, systematically, professionally, with no shortcuts. "What's your airspeed?" 120 knots. "Altitude?" 3,000 feet, climbing. "You're in a stall. What do you do?" "Push forward, reduce angle of attack, add power, level wings." "Show me." And Sophie would execute the recovery perfectly, her small hands moving with confidence that seemed impossible for someone who still watched cartoons and played with dolls. By age 7, Sophie could explain the 4 forces of flight, lift, weight, thrust, drag, better than most student pilots. She understood what a stall was and why it happened. She could read instruments, calculate fuel consumption, and understand weather patterns. Jack taught her pre-flight procedures, emergency protocols, and radio communication. He made her practice the same scenarios hundreds of times until they became reflexive. "Why do we practice so much?" Sophie had asked once, frustrated after her 50th simulated engine failure. "Because when something goes wrong in real life, you won't have time to think. You have to know what to do in your bones. Muscle memory, kiddo. We're programming your instincts." When Sophie was 8, Jack took her to a private airstrip 2 hours outside Portland, the kind of place where nobody asks questions if you pay cash and don't cause trouble. He rented a Cessna 152, the smallest trainer aircraft available, and for the first time, Sophie flew a real airplane. She was terrified. The simulator didn't capture the noise, the vibration, the overwhelming reality of being inside a machine that was fighting gravity. But Jack talked her through it, his voice calm and steady, and after 10 minutes, something clicked. Sophie stopped being afraid and started listening to what the aircraft was telling her. She flew for 40 minutes that day. Her legs barely reached the pedals even with seat cushions. Her view over the instrument panel required her to sit on 2 more cushions. But she flew. Really flew. "Dad," she'd said when they landed, her face glowing, "can we do that again?" They did. Again and again. Every weekend for 3 years, weather permitting, they made the drive to that private airstrip or to another one even more remote. Jack always filed flight plans under his own name. He was always listed as pilot in command. But once they were airborne and away from controlled airspace, Sophie flew. She graduated from the Cessna 152 to a 172 to a Piper Archer. By age 10, she'd logged over 300 hours. She could handle crosswind landings, practice engine-out emergencies, execute instrument approaches using only the gauges. Jack built increasingly sophisticated simulators at home, including one that replicated the cockpit of a Boeing 737, and Sophie spent hundreds of additional hours practicing commercial aircraft procedures. "You know this is crazy, right?" Jack had said to her once, when she was 10 and practicing a simulated emergency landing in the 737 simulator. "You know I could lose my license for this. Could go to jail. People would say I'm endangering you." Sophie had looked at him seriously, her young face thoughtful. "Do you think you're endangering me? I think I'm teaching you something you have a gift for. I think you're safer in an aircraft with proper training than most kids are on a bicycle. But other people wouldn't see it that way. Then we don't tell them." "No," Jack agreed. "We don't. It was their secret." Sophie never told her friends at school. Never mentioned it to her aunt or her teachers. She lived 2 lives, the ordinary girl who liked graphic novels and stuffed animals, and the pilot who could fly aircraft that most adults couldn't handle. She never questioned whether it was right or wrong. Her father loved her, believed in her, and challenged her. The flying felt natural, like breathing. She didn't know that what they were doing was impossible. She just knew it was beautiful. But 2 weeks ago, everything changed. Jack collapsed during a test flight. His co-pilot landed the aircraft safely, but by the time the paramedics arrived, Jack had suffered a massive stroke. He survived, but his right side was partially paralyzed. He couldn't grip controls. Couldn't walk without assistance. His career was over. Sophie had cried for 3 days straight. Her aunt flew in from Phoenix to help. Social services got involved, asking questions about long-term custody. Jack was in no condition to care for a child alone. Sophie spent a week in Portland, mostly at the hospital, then flew to Phoenix to stay with her aunt while the adults figured out what came next. She hadn't flown, really flown, since her father's stroke. Sitting in seat 12C of Southwest Flight 1134, she felt like a part of herself had been amputated. She was just a passenger now. Just a kid. Just Sophie. But 30,000 feet above the California-Oregon border, Sophie Mitchell was about to discover that some things you can't leave behind, even when you want to. The captain's voice on the intercom was wrong. Sophie looked up from her graphic novel, instantly alert. She'd heard thousands of pilot announcements in her life, both as a passenger and over the radio during her own flights. She knew what calm professionalism sounded like. This wasn't it. Flight attendants, a pause, labored breathing. Please come to the cockpit immediately. Not when convenient. Not at your earliest opportunity. Immediately. The businessman in 12B frowned at his laptop. The woman in 12A looked up from her knitting. But Sophie felt her stomach drop because she understood what that word meant. In aviation, immediately means emergency. Means something is catastrophically wrong. The three flight attendants exchanged glances, quick, worried. Michelle and another attendant rushed forward. The cockpit door opened briefly, and Sophie heard fragments. Captain Chen is, get a doctor, oh God, Lisa's. The door closed. 15 seconds of terrible silence. Then the announcement that made the cabin collectively hold its breath. Ladies and gentlemen, if there is a doctor or nurse on board, please press your call button immediately. This is urgent. 3 call buttons illuminated. Flight attendants rushed to those seats. Sophie watched as an ER nurse and a man identifying himself as a dentist were escorted to the front. A third person, someone claiming to be a veterinarian, was politely turned away. The plane continued flying smoothly. Autopilot, Sophie thought automatically. Someone engaged the autopilot before they became incapacitated. That's procedure. That's what you're supposed to do. But then she felt it, a subtle wrongness in the aircraft's attitude. Small corrections that weren't quite right. Someone in the cockpit was making manual inputs, and they weren't smooth. They were jerky, uncertain, overcorrected. 5 minutes passed. The businessman kept working, oblivious. The elderly woman clutched her knitting tighter. Throughout the cabin, people whispered nervously. A child somewhere in back started crying. Then the plane dropped. Just for a second, maybe 2, but enough that people gasped and grabbed armrests and overhead bins. The aircraft recovered, but sloppily, with an overcorrection that made it bounce slightly. Sophie's hands were white-knuckled around Mr. Trunk. She knew that drop. She'd practiced it in simulators. That was what happened when someone who didn't know what they were doing tried to correct an autopilot disconnect. They over-controlled. Panicked. The intercom crackled again, and this time the voice was female, stressed, definitely not a flight attendant's trained professional comm. Ladies and gentlemen, this is. I'm an emergency room nurse. We have a situation. Both pilots are unconscious. I repeat, both pilots are unconscious. Her voice cracked. If there is anyone, with flight experience, even private pilots, student pilots, anyone who has ever flown any kind of aircraft, please come to the front of the cabin immediately. For one frozen moment, the cabin was silent. Then it erupted. Screaming, crying, a man shouting, we're all going to die. A woman wailing, my babies, my babies. The child in back went from crying to shrieking. Someone started praying loudly in Spanish. Someone else was hyperventilating. The businessman in 12B turned dead white and closed his laptop with shaking hands. Sophie sat perfectly still. Both pilots unconscious, nobody flying. 198 people about to fall out of the sky. She looked down at herself. Purple leggings, unicorn hoodie. Messy braids. Mr. Trunk clutched in her small hands. She was 11 years old. She was 4'8". She looked like she should be at a sleepover, not in a cockpit. But she had 400 hours. She'd practiced every emergency scenario her father could imagine. She knew what to do when pilots became incapacitated because they drilled it dozens of times: stabilize the aircraft, establish communication, follow controller guidance, execute the approach, land safely. She could fly this plane. But I'm 11, the scared part of her whispered. I'm just a kid. Nobody will believe me. They'll think I'm crazy. They'll tell me to sit down and shut up and let the adults handle it. Except there were no adults handling it. The nurse wasn't a pilot. The dentist wasn't a pilot. Nobody was coming forward because nobody on this plane could fly. Nobody except Sophie Mitchell. Her father's voice echoed in her memory from a simulator session months ago. Sophie, what's the first rule when something goes wrong? Don't panic. And the second rule? Act. Don't wait. Act. Sophie unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. The businessman grabbed her arm. Kid, sit down. This isn't, you can't. But Sophie pulled away and started moving forward, squeezing through the growing chaos in the aisle. People were standing now, some trying to rush the cockpit, others trying to get to the back of the plane as if distance from the pilots would somehow save them. She was small enough to slip between them, under grasping hands, through gaps that adults couldn't fit. Someone stepped on her foot. Someone else's elbow caught her shoulder. But she kept moving, clutching Mr. Trunk under one arm, pushing forward. A flight attendant, the male attendant whose name tag read James, saw her and grabbed her shoulders. Sweetie, you need to get back to your seat. This is an emergency. I can fly, Sophie said. James stared at her like she'd spoken another language. What? I can fly this plane. I'm a pilot. You're a child. I have over 400 hours of flight time. My dad is Jack Mitchell. He's a test pilot. He's been training me since I was 6. I can fly commercial aircraft. I've practiced on 737 simulators. I know the procedures. James looked at this tiny girl in a unicorn hoodie making an impossible claim, and Sophie saw the calculation in his eyes. This is insane. This can't be real. But what if? Please, Sophie said, and her voice broke slightly, the 11-year-old girl cracking through the pilot's confidence. I know you don't believe me. I know it sounds crazy. But both pilots are unconscious and nobody else is coming forward and 198 people are going to die if someone doesn't fly this plane. I can do it. Please let me try. Behind them, the aircraft dropped again, harder this time, several seconds of stomach-lurching descent before recovering. More screams. A crash as someone's luggage fell from an overhead bin. James made an impossible decision. He grabbed Sophie's hand. Come with me. God help us all. The cockpit was worse than Sophie had imagined. Captain Marcus Chen was slumped over the left side controls, unconscious, his full weight pressing on the yoke and forcing the aircraft into a subtle nose-down attitude that the autopilot was struggling to correct. He was maybe 50, Asian American, with the silver-streaked hair of a veteran pilot. His face had a grayish tint that Sophie recognized from her father's stroke, oxygen-starved tissue, brain damage happening in real time. The first officer, young, white woman, name tag reading Lisa Park, was partially conscious but clearly incoherent. Her eyes were open but unfocused, rolling slightly. She was mumbling something that might have been words or might have been nothing. Her right hand twitched on her lap, trying to move but not completing the motion. The ER nurse, a woman in her 30s with short dark hair and wild, terrified eyes, was crouched between the seats, checking pulses, trying desperately to help with medical knowledge that meant nothing in a cockpit. I don't know what to do, she was saying to the dentist. I think they both had heart attacks or strokes or, they just collapsed, both of them, maybe 30 seconds apart. The dentist, balding, heavy-set, maybe 60, sat in the observer seat behind the pilots, his hands hovering uselessly over controls he clearly didn't understand. His face was the color of old milk. Sophie stepped into the cockpit and everything changed. Her father's training clicked into place like tumblers in a lock. She stopped being an 11-year-old girl and became a pilot. Not because she wasn't scared, she was terrified, but because there was a job to do and fear was a luxury nobody aboard this aircraft could afford. "Sir," she said to the dentist, her voice carrying an authority that didn't match her size, "I need you to help me move the captain away from the controls. Carefully. Don't let him hit anything." The dentist stared at her. "Who are you?" "I'm the pilot now. Help me move him." Something in her tone, the absolute certainty, the lack of hesitation, made him obey. Together, they gently pulled the unconscious captain back in his seat, repositioning his weight away from the yoke. Immediately, the aircraft stabilized as the autopilot stopped fighting human input. "Ma'am," Sophie said to the nurse, "can you secure both pilots in their seats with the harnesses? I need them safe but out of the way." The nurse nodded, moving mechanically, grateful for any instruction that made sense. Sophie climbed into the first officer's seat. She was so small that even with the seat adjusted all the way forward, her feet barely reached the rudder pedals. She grabbed 2 seat cushions from the observer seat and wedged them behind her back, pushing herself forward another crucial few inches. The headset was too big, sliding down over her forehead. She adjusted it awkwardly, pushing the microphone boom toward her mouth. Her hands were shaking. She forced them still. First, assess. She scanned the instruments with practiced efficiency, her eyes moving in the pattern her father had drilled into her thousands of times: airspeed, altitude, heading, fuel, systems. Airspeed, 280 knots, a bit fast for this altitude but not dangerous. Altitude, 30,000 feet, stable. Heading, 315 degrees, roughly correct for Portland. Fuel, 3/4 full, plenty. Engine instruments, all green, both engines running normally. Hydraulics, green. Electrical, green. Weather radar, clear skies ahead. The aircraft was fine. The autopilot was engaged and functioning. They weren't in immediate danger of falling out of the sky. But they couldn't stay at 30,000 feet forever. Eventually they'd need to descend, navigate the approach, and land. And none of that could be done on autopilot alone. Second, communicate. Sophie took a deep breath and keyed the radio. Her voice came out higher than she wanted, unmistakably a child's voice. "Seattle Center, this is Southwest 1134. I'm declaring an emergency." Immediate response, "Southwest 1134, Seattle Center, go ahead." "Seattle Center, both pilots aboard Southwest 1134 are unconscious. Medical emergency. I'm a passenger, and I'm taking control of the aircraft." Pause. Then, "Southwest 1134, say again." "Both pilots are unconscious. I'm an 11-year-old passenger." Sophie forced the words out steadily. "But I have flight training. 400 hours. I'm type familiar with 737 systems from simulator work. I can fly this aircraft. I need vectors to the nearest suitable airport and approach guidance." The silence on the radio lasted so long that Sophie thought they hadn't heard her. Then, "Southwest 1134, did you say you're 11 years old?" "Yes, sir." "Jesus Christ." The controller's voice was barely audible, talking to someone else. Then, louder, "Southwest 1134, stand by." Sophie waited, watching the instruments, making tiny corrections to keep the aircraft stable. Behind her, the ER nurse had finished securing the pilots. The dentist sat frozen in the observer seat, staring at Sophie like he was witnessing something supernatural. A different voice came on the radio, older, calmer, carrying authority. "Southwest 1134, this is Dave Carson, Senior Controller, Seattle Center. I need you to stay very calm for me. What's your name?" "Sophie Mitchell, sir." "Okay, Sophie. I need you to tell me exactly what's happening up there." Sophie took another breath and delivered her situation report in the format her father had taught her, clear, concise, complete. "Both pilots unconscious, approximately 5 minutes ago. Looks like simultaneous cardiac or neurological events. We have medical personnel aboard but they're not pilots. Aircraft is currently stable at flight level 300, autopilot engaged. All systems normal. I have control of the aircraft. I'm familiar with 737 cockpit layout and basic procedures from simulator training. I've never flown a 737 in real life, but I have 400 hours in small aircraft and extensive simulator time in commercial jets. I can hand fly if necessary. I need guidance on the approach and landing procedures. Another pause. Sophie imagined the scene at Seattle Center, controllers staring at their supervisor in disbelief, someone pulling up Southwest's flight plan, someone else frantically trying to verify if this was real or some kind of hoax. Sophie, Dave Carson said slowly, you sound like you know what you're doing. Yes, sir. My father is Jack Maverick Mitchell. He's a test pilot. He trained me properly, same procedures, same standards. I can do this. But I need help. Jack Mitchell. The controller's voice changed. Test pilot Mitchell. I've heard of him. He's a legend. Yes, sir. He taught me to fly. I can do this. I need you to believe me. Sophie, Portland International is 90 miles ahead of you. I'm going to get you there. Just listen carefully to everything I tell you and we'll bring you home safe. Can you do that? Yes, sir. Okay. First thing, don't touch anything yet. Just let the autopilot fly. I'm going to coordinate with Portland Approach, get emergency services ready, and we'll walk you through this step by step. You're going to be fine. Thank you, sir. Sophie's hands were still shaking, but they were the right kind of shaking, adrenaline, not panic. She was scared, but she was in control. That was the difference her father had taught her, fear was data. Panic was failure. She glanced back at the nurse. How are they? The nurse looked up, her eyes red. Both have pulses. Both breathing. But they need a hospital soon. They'll get one, Sophie said. I'm going to land this plane. The nurse stared at this small girl in a unicorn hoodie sitting in the first officer's seat making an impossible promise, and something in her face shifted from terror to hope. In the cabin behind them, 197 people waited to learn if they would live or die. And in the cockpit, Sophie Mitchell prepared to prove that competence doesn't have an age requirement. The news broke within minutes. Somewhere, someone at Seattle Center leaked it, maybe deliberately, maybe accidentally. But by the time Sophie had been in the cockpit for 15 minutes, every news organization in the Pacific Northwest knew, an 11-year-old girl was flying a commercial jetliner with 200 people aboard. CNN broke the story first, breaking, child pilot attempts to land commercial aircraft after both pilots suffer medical emergency. Then Fox, 11-year-old girl flying Southwest jet, live situation developing. MSNBC, unprecedented aviation emergency as miner takes controls of 737. Within 30 minutes, it was the top story on every news outlet in North America. Within 45 minutes, it was international. The story was too extraordinary, too impossible, too compelling to ignore. News helicopters scrambled from every major city in Oregon and Washington. Camera crews rushed to Portland International Airport. Reporters called aviation experts, demanding explanations for how this was possible. And on social media, the world lost its collective mind. Twitter exploded, hashtag Sophie Mitchell, hashtag child pilot, hashtag flight 1134. An 11-year-old is flying a plane right now and I can't even parallel park. This is either the most inspiring thing ever or the most irresponsible parenting ever and I can't decide which. That girl has more composure at 11 than I have at 35. Who let a child learn to fly a plane? Who cares how she learned, she's saving 200 people. The debate was instant and fierce. Is this child exploitation? Is this a miracle? Should children be allowed to learn advanced skills like this? Should we be grateful or outraged? In the cockpit, Sophie was too busy to notice. She listened to the controller's instructions, made small adjustments to heading and speed, and monitored every instrument with the focus her father had trained into her. Southwest 1134, descend and maintain 15,000, Dave Carson instructed. Descending to 15,000, Sophie confirmed, her small hands moving to the autopilot controls. She dialed in the new altitude and watched as the aircraft began a smooth descent. Sophie, you're doing perfectly. How are you feeling? Scared, Sophie admitted. But okay. The aircraft is behaving normally. All systems green. You've got this, kiddo. Portland weather is clear, winds light. We're going to line you up for the straightest, longest runway we have. Just keep doing what you're doing. Behind her, the dentist finally found his voice. How do you know how to do this? Sophie glanced back briefly. My dad taught me. We practiced thousands of hours in simulators. And I've flown real planes, just not this big. But you're a child. Yes, sir. But right now, I'm also the only pilot on this aircraft. So I'm going to do my job. The male flight attendant, James, appeared in the doorway. Sophie, the passengers they know a child is flying. Some heard the radio call. Others saw you come in here. They're terrified. Sophie thought for a moment. Can you tell them I've been training since I was 6. Tell them I have hundreds of hours. Tell them I know what I'm doing. And tell them I'm going to land safely because that's what pilots do. James stared at her, then nodded slowly. I'll tell them. As he left, Sophie heard him on the cabin PA, ladies and gentlemen, I know you're scared. I know this situation is unprecedented. But the young woman flying this aircraft has extensive training and experience. Her father is a professional test pilot who has been teaching her to fly for 5 years. She has over 400 hours of flight time. She knows these procedures. And she's going to bring us home safely. Young woman, Sophie noticed. Not child. Not girl. He was giving her authority, giving passengers something to hold on to. Dave Carson's voice came back, Sophie, we've got someone else who wants to talk to you. Patching them through now. A new voice, female, military, carrying the weight of command, Sophie Mitchell, this is Colonel Sarah Tang, United States Air Force, monitoring your situation from McCord. Your father and I flew together years ago. He's one of the best pilots I've ever known. And if Jack Mitchell trained you, then I believe you can do this. Sophie's vision blurred with sudden tears, but her voice stayed steady. Thank you, ma'am. I won't let him down. You couldn't let him down if you tried, Sophie. He's going to be so proud of you. Now let's bring those people home. The radio chatter continued, vectors, altitudes, speeds, as Seattle Center and Portland Approach coordinated the most unusual emergency landing in aviation history. Sophie followed every instruction precisely, her hands moving with the confidence of hundreds of hours of practice. At the FAA Command Center in Washington, D.C., officials watched the situation unfold on screens with mounting disbelief. This is impossible, someone kept saying. An 11-year-old can't fly a 737. This can't be happening. But it was happening. And against all logic, all expectations, all conventional wisdom, Sophie Mitchell was flying that aircraft like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Because she did. At 15,000 feet, Portland was visible on the horizon, the city sprawling beside the Willamette River, the airport's runways carved out of the landscape like surgical scars. Southwest 1134, Portland Approach, how are you doing up there? Doing okay, Sophie said. Her voice was smaller now, thinner. The reality was starting to press down on her, not just flying, but landing. Landing a 737. Landing with 198 lives depending on her not making a mistake. Sophie, I'm going to walk you through the landing checklist step by step. We're going to do this together, okay? Yes, sir. First, I need you to confirm your fuel state. Sophie checked the gauge. Showing 6,000 pounds, more than enough for the landing and a go-around if needed. Perfect. Now, descent checklist. We're going to start configuring for landing. On your mode control panel, that's the autopilot controls, I need you to slow the aircraft to 250 knots. Sophie's hands moved to the speed selector. She'd practiced this in simulators so many times that the movement was automatic. She dialed in 250 knots and watched the auto throttles begin reducing power. Speed set to 250. Good. Now I need you to extend the flaps to position 1. There should be a lever on the center pedestal. I see it. Sophie moved the flap lever. The aircraft shuddered slightly as the trailing edge flaps deployed, increasing lift and drag. Flaps 1. How does she feel? Stable. Slight nose-up trim change, compensating. The controller's voice carried surprise. You felt that? Yes, sir. The center of lift shifted aft when the flaps deployed. Aircraft wanted to pitch up. I trimmed it out. Silence on the radio. Then, Sophie, you really do know what you're doing. Yes, sir. My dad made sure of it. For the next 20 minutes, Sophie followed the controller's instructions with mechanical precision, but her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Each step brought her closer to the moment she'd only practiced in simulators, the actual landing. Southwest 1134, turn left heading 270. Descend and maintain 7,000. Left to 270, descending to 7,000. The aircraft banked gently, responding to her input. Sophie could see fire trucks and ambulances lining the runway, a wall of flashing lights, emergency vehicles staged for disaster. They're preparing for me to crash, she thought. They don't think I can do this. Sophie. Colonel Tang's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. Talk to me. What are you thinking right now? That everyone expects me to fail. Wrong. Everyone expects a miracle. And you're giving them one. Your father told me once that the hardest part of flying isn't the technical skill, it's the mental game. You can't fly scared. You have to fly certain. Are you certain, Sophie? Sophie closed her eyes for just a moment, feeling the aircraft through her hands, hearing her father's voice. You've got this, kiddo. Trust your training. Yes, ma'am. I'm certain. Then prove it. Southwest 1134, you're 10 miles from the runway. Reduce speed to 180 knots. Flaps 5. 180 knots, flaps 5. The aircraft slowed further. Sophie felt the flight characteristics change, more drag, more lift, the aircraft settling into landing configuration. It felt heavy now, committed, like a bird preparing to land. Flaps 15. Flaps 15. Landing gear down. This was the big one. Sophie's hand moved to the gear lever, and for just a second, she hesitated. Once the gear was down, there was no going back. They were landing, one way or another. She pushed the lever down. The rumble of the landing gear extending vibrated through the aircraft. 3 green lights illuminated on the panel, nose gear, left main, right main. All down and locked. Gear down, 3 green, Sophie reported, her voice shaking slightly. Beautiful, Sophie. You're doing beautiful. 5 miles, flaps 25. Flaps 25. The runway filled her windscreen now, concrete and numbers and lights guiding her home. It looked impossibly long and impossibly short at the same time. Sophie, you're on a perfect approach. 1,000 feet above touchdown. Speed 140. Start looking for the runway. I have it. Visual with the runway. Okay. I'm going to let you hand fly from here. Disconnect the autopilot. You've got the aircraft. Sophie's hand hovered over the autopilot disconnect button. This was it. From here on, it was all her, no computer backup, no autopilot safety net. Just an 11-year-old girl and a 150-ton aircraft. She pressed the button. The subtle resistance vanished. Suddenly she could feel everything, the weight of the aircraft, the slight crosswind pushing at the vertical stabilizer, the delicate balance of lift and drag and thrust and gravity. It was alive in her hands, and she understood why her father loved flying. "I have the aircraft," Sophie said. 500 feet, looking good. Speed 135. Sophie made a tiny correction, feeling the aircraft respond. The runway centerline stayed perfectly aligned with her nose. The descent rate was steady. The sink rate was right. Everything was exactly how it should be. 200 feet. "You're perfect, Sophie. Stay with it." Her world narrowed to the runway and the instruments and the feeling in her hands. Nothing else existed. Not the cameras. Not the news helicopters. Not the 198 people behind her. Just the aircraft and the landing. 100 feet. Flaps full. Start your flare. Sophie eased back on the yoke, gentle, feeling for the perfect moment. The aircraft's nose came up slightly. The descent rate decreased. The ground rushed up. 50 feet. Hold it. Hold it. The main wheels kissed the runway so gently that for a moment, Sophie wasn't sure they were down. Then she felt it, the rumble of rubber on concrete, the aircraft settling its full weight onto the landing gear. "Reversers," the controller said, but Sophie was already moving, pulling the thrust reverser levers. The engines roared, pushing against forward motion. She applied brakes smoothly, progressively, feeling the aircraft slow. They rolled down the centerline, perfectly straight, speed bleeding off with every second. 100 knots. 80. 60. 40. 20 knots, and Sophie steered the aircraft off the runway onto a taxiway where emergency vehicles surrounded them immediately. She set the parking brake and shut down the engines. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then the cabin behind her exploded with sound, cheering, crying, screaming with joy and relief. People who thought they were going to die were hugging strangers, sobbing, laughing hysterically. Sophie sat in the pilot's seat, hands still on the controls, and whispered, "I did it, Dad. I landed them all safely." Then she started crying, great heaving sobs of relief and exhaustion and overwhelming emotion that she'd been holding back for the last hour. She was 11 years old again, just a kid who'd been terrified and brave and who needed her father desperately. The ER nurse put a hand on her shoulder. "You saved us. All of us. You saved us." Sophie nodded, unable to speak, tears streaming down her face onto her unicorn hoodie. Outside, paramedics swarmed the aircraft. Inside, passengers filed off slowly, many stopping to look at the cockpit, at the small girl who'd brought them home. One man, the businessman from 12B, stopped and stared at Sophie for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "I'm sorry I told you to sit down. I'm sorry I didn't believe you." Sophie wiped her eyes. "It's okay. I wouldn't have believed me either." When she finally climbed out of the cockpit, legs shaky, Mr. Trunk tucked under her arm, the flight attendant James hugged her so hard he lifted her off the ground. "You're a miracle," he whispered. "A genuine miracle." But Sophie didn't feel like a miracle. She felt like a pilot who'd done her job. Just like her father taught her. Within 12 hours, Sophie Mitchell's face was on every screen in the world. 11-year-old lands commercial jet, all passengers survive. Child pilot saves 200 lives in miracle landing. Youngest person to ever fly commercial aircraft, age 11. The FAA building in Portland where they'd taken Sophie for debriefing was surrounded by news vans. Her aunt arrived from Phoenix, pushing through reporters, and held Sophie while she cried for an hour straight. The relief, the fear, the weight of what had happened, it all came out in waves. Captain Chen and First Officer Park were in ICU, both having suffered severe cardiac events caused by a rare, undiagnosed genetic condition triggered by cabin pressure changes. They would survive, but their flying careers were over. Both would later tell reporters that they owed their lives to Sophie Mitchell. The debate erupted immediately, fierce and divided. Dr. Laura Chen, child psychologist on CNN, "What happened to this child is exploitation, regardless of the outcome. An 11-year-old's brain isn't developed enough to handle the stress of flying a commercial aircraft. Her father's actions, while well-intentioned, constituted child endangerment." Captain Mike Rodriguez, retired airline pilot on Fox, "Sophie Mitchell had more flight time and better training than half the commercial pilots I've worked with. Her father saw extraordinary ability and nurtured it." Are we saying talent doesn't matter if it exists in a child's body? Twitter was equally divided. This is inspiring and horrifying at the same time. She saved lives and shouldn't have had to. Everyone criticizing her dad, would you rather those 198 people died? She was literally the only person who could help. There's a difference between, "should this have happened," and "I'm grateful it did." Both can be true. Age limits exist for a reason. Flying is not a child's job. Period. Competence is competence. She proved age is sometimes just a number. At the press conference 3 days later, Sophie sat beside her aunt, still looking impossibly small in a chair designed for adults. She wore jeans and a regular hoodie, no unicorn this time. Mr. Trunk was safely at her aunt's house. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes. A reporter asked, "Sophie, how did you stay so calm?" Sophie's voice was quiet but clear. "My dad always said that fear is okay but panic is not. I was really scared. But I had a job to do, keeping those people safe. So I focused on that instead of the fear." Do you think you should have been trained to fly at such a young age? Sophie thought carefully before answering, "I don't know if it was right or wrong. I just know that when those pilots got sick, I was the only person on that plane who could help. If my dad hadn't trained me, everyone would have died. So I'm grateful he taught me, even if it was against the rules." What do you want people to understand? That sometimes age doesn't matter as much as skills. My dad saw that I could learn flying the way some kids can learn music or math, really well, really young. He didn't force me. I loved it. And when it mattered most, those skills saved lives. Maybe instead of arguing about whether kids should learn things, we should think about what each kid can actually do. Another reporter, "Do you think you're a hero?" "No," Sophie said firmly. "I think I'm a pilot who did her job. Heroes are people who choose to do something brave. I didn't choose this situation, it just happened. I just used what my dad taught me. He's the hero. He believed in me when nobody else would have." What's next for you? Sophie smiled slightly, the first real smile anyone had seen from her since the landing. "First, I have to finish 6th grade. I've missed a lot of homework. Then, I don't know. I'll keep learning. Keep practicing. When I turn 16 and can legally get my pilot's license, I'll already have over 1,000 hours. I'll probably be the most experienced teenage pilot in history." She paused, then added, "But right now, I mostly want to see my dad. He's still in rehab. I want to tell him I did it right. I want him to be proud." "Do you think he is?" Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "I hope so. I really hope so." 6 months later, Sophie testified before a Congressional Aviation Safety Committee. Her father, Jack Mitchell, attended from a wheelchair, his right side still partially paralyzed but his eyes bright with pride and love. The hearing room was packed with reporters, aviation experts, child advocacy groups, and the curious public. Senators from both parties had strong opinions, and none of them agreed. Senator James Warren, Republican Texas, "Mr. Mitchell, you violated federal regulations, potentially endangered your daughter, and taught a minor to operate aircraft without proper licensing or oversight. Many would call that criminal. Jack's voice was steady despite his physical limitations. "Senator, I trained my daughter the same way I was trained at the test pilot school, professionally, systematically, with no shortcuts." Was it unconventional? Absolutely. But Sophie didn't just stumble into that cockpit with beginner's luck. She had 400 hours of real flight time and hundreds more in advanced simulators. When that emergency happened, she was the most qualified pilot on that aircraft. Senator Lisa Chen, Democrat, California, but she was 11 years old. 11. Children's brains are still developing. They lack impulse control, risk assessment. Senator, Jack interrupted gently, Sophie demonstrated better risk assessment and impulse control than most adults in that situation. She stayed calm, followed procedures, communicated effectively, and executed a perfect landing. Her age didn't make her less capable. Her training made her capable, period. Senator Warren, what about the psychological impact? The trauma of that responsibility? Sophie, sitting at the witness table, spoke up, "Senator, may I answer that?" He nodded, surprised. It was scary. Really scary. But you know what would have been traumatic? Sitting in my seat doing nothing while everyone died because I was too afraid to admit I could help. My dad didn't force me to learn flying, I loved it. And when that moment came, I was grateful I knew how. I'm not traumatized by saving people. I'd be traumatized if I hadn't tried. Dr. Michael Foster, child psychologist testifying for the committee, with respect, Sophie, you might not recognize the trauma yet. The long-term psychological effects of placing adult responsibility on a child. Dr. Foster, Sophie interrupted, her voice sharp, I'm not damaged. I'm trained. There's a difference. My dad saw that I had a gift for spatial reasoning and flight mechanics. He nurtured it the same way parents nurture gifted musicians or mathematicians. The only difference is that my gift happened to save lives when it mattered. The debate continued for hours. Expert after expert testified, some supporting Jack's training approach, others condemning it. But nobody could escape the fundamental question that Sophie herself had raised. Would you rather she hadn't known how to fly? The FAA ultimately created a special commendation for Sophie, carefully worded to neither condone the illegal training nor ignore the life-saving outcome. Captain Chen and First Officer Park both attended the ceremony, both hugging Sophie tearfully. You gave us our lives back, Captain Chen said. My grandchildren have me because of you. First Officer Park added, I'm going to tell my kids about you. About how sometimes the most important thing isn't following rules, it's having the courage to do what's right. Jack Mitchell was investigated by Child Protective Services, by the FAA, and by local authorities. In the end, no charges were filed. The prosecutor's statement read, while Mr. Mitchell's training methods were unconventional and technically violated regulations, the outcome, his daughter saving 198 lives, demonstrates that his judgment of her capabilities was sound. We find no evidence of intent to harm or exploit. But the debate didn't end. It continued in op-eds and think pieces, in college ethics classes and aviation forums. When is training children in advanced skills appropriate? How do we balance safety regulations with individual capability? What do we do when someone proves they can do something they're supposedly too young to do? Where's the line between nurturing talent and exploiting children? Nobody had clear answers. A year after Southwest Flight 1134, Sophie Mitchell returned to what passed for normal life. She was in 7th grade now, 12 years old, slightly taller but still small for her age. She still liked graphic novels and stuffed animals. She still had Mr. Trunk, though he mostly stayed on her bed now instead of going everywhere with her. School was complicated. Some kids treated her like a celebrity. Others resented the attention she got. Most just didn't know how to relate to someone who'd done something so impossibly adult. Sophie found herself gravitating toward the quiet kids, the ones who didn't care about fame or gossip. She still flew, legally now, with her father supervising from his wheelchair at the airstrip. Jack had recovered enough mobility to work as a ground instructor, and they spent weekends at the same private fields where Sophie had learned, now properly documenting every hour in her logbook. "How does it feel?" Jack asked one Saturday, watching Sophie complete a perfect pattern in the Cessna 172. "Different," Sophie said after landing. "Now everyone knows. Before, it was just our secret. Now everyone watches me land like they're waiting for me to mess up or do something miraculous. I'm just flying, Dad. Just flying like you taught me. You okay with all the attention?" Sophie shrugged. "Some days yes, some days no. Mostly I just want to be a normal kid who also happens to fly." "You'll never be just a normal kid, sophomore. You did something extraordinary." "I did what you taught me to do. That's all." Jack smiled. "That's exactly the right attitude. Never let them make you more than you are. You're a good pilot with proper training who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Nothing more, nothing less." But the world wasn't ready to let Sophie be just a pilot. She received speaking invitations from aviation organizations, women in STEM groups, youth leadership conferences. Some she accepted, talking about her father's training methods, about learning to fly, about staying calm in emergencies. Others she declined. She was still in school, still doing homework and taking tests and trying to have a childhood. When she turned 13, the FAA created a special provision allowing her to test for her private pilot license early, given her documented flight hours. She passed the written test with a perfect score. The practical test took 3 hours, with an examiner who was initially skeptical but became increasingly impressed. "You fly like someone with 10 times your hours," he told her afterward, signing her temporary certificate. "Your father trained you right." "He trained me the same way he was trained," Sophie said. "He just started earlier." On her 14th birthday, Sophie visited Captain Chen in his home in Phoenix. He'd retired from flying but worked as an aviation safety consultant. His office wall had a photo of Sophie in the cockpit of Flight 1134, taken by investigators after the landing. "Do you think I did the right thing?" Sophie asked him. Captain Chen looked surprised. "Saving our lives?" "Of course. No, I mean, learning to fly so young, putting myself in that position. Everyone has opinions, but you were there. You almost died because I was flying. Do you think it was right?" Captain Chen was quiet for a long moment. "Sophie, I've thought about that question a lot. And here's what I've concluded. I don't know if your father's training methods were right or wrong in the abstract. But I know they produced a competent pilot. And I know that competent pilot saved my life and 197 others. So am I grateful? Yes. Would I recommend other parents do what your father did? I honestly don't know." "That's fair," Sophie said. "But I'll tell you this," he continued. "You handled that situation better than many experienced pilots would have. Not because you're special or magical, but because you were properly trained. Your father saw ability and nurtured it. That's what good teachers do. The only unusual thing was your age, and your age didn't matter in the cockpit that day. Your training did." Sophie nodded slowly. "Everyone wants me to be either a hero or a victim. But I'm neither. I'm just a pilot who happened to be on the right flight." "That's exactly right," Captain Chen said. "And that's the most mature perspective I've heard from anyone about this, including all the experts and commentators. You understand something most adults don't, that extraordinary circumstances don't make you extraordinary. How you handle them does. And you handled them exactly right." When Sophie Mitchell turned 18 and graduated high school, she had logged over 2,000 flight hours across dozens of aircraft types. She'd earned her private license at 13, her instrument rating at 14, her commercial license at 16, and her multi-engine rating at 17. She'd done it all legally, properly documented, with her father supervising every hour despite his limited mobility. She'd received full-ride scholarship offers from every major aeronautical university in the country. She chose Embry-Riddle, the same school her father had attended. At her high school graduation party, surrounded by family and friends, someone asked the inevitable question, "So you're going to be an airline pilot?" Sophie smiled. "Maybe eventually. But first I want to be a test pilot like my dad. I want to fly aircraft that haven't been fully figured out yet. I want to push boundaries." Jack, now able to walk with a cane, raised his glass. "To my daughter, who proved that ability matters more than age, that proper training transcends expectations, and that sometimes the most important thing a parent can do is believe in their child's capacity to do the impossible." Everyone drank to that. Later, Sophie found her father on the back porch, watching the sunset. "You okay, Dad?" "Just thinking about that day," Jack said. "When you called on the radio. When I heard you'd taken control. I was in my hospital bed, partially paralyzed, and all I could think was, I trained her for this. She's ready. She can do this. You were right. I was terrified I was wrong. If you'd crashed, if all those people had died because of my decision to train you, I don't think I could have lived with that." Sophie sat beside him. "But they didn't die. Because you trained me. Because you saw that I could learn and you didn't let rules stop you from teaching me. Was it conventional? No. But it worked. Do you regret it? The training, the pressure, the burden I put on you? Dad, you gave me a gift. You saw something in me that nobody else saw and you nurtured it. Yes, it was hard. Yes, it was sometimes scary. Yes, it put me in an impossible situation. But it also saved lives. And it taught me that I'm capable of more than society expects from someone my age. I'm grateful. Every single day, I'm grateful." Jack wiped his eyes. "You're the best thing I ever did, kiddo. Better than any aircraft I ever flew." "Well," Sophie said with a grin, "I did land a 737 at 11. That's got to count for something." They laughed together, and for a moment, everything was simple, just a father and daughter who loved flying and loved each other. Dr. Sophie Mitchell, age 28, stood in the test pilot briefing room at Edwards Air Force Base, preparing to fly an experimental hypersonic aircraft that existed nowhere else on Earth. She'd earned her Ph.D. in aerospace engineering at 24 while simultaneously completing test pilot school. She'd flown fighter jets, experimental drones, and cutting-edge aircraft that most people would never see. And she still remembered Southwest Flight 1134. A reporter was there, doing a documentary about her career. "Do you think about that day often?" "Every time I fly," Sophie said honestly. "It taught me that fear and competence can coexist. That training matters more than natural talent. That when something needs to be done, you do it, regardless of whether you feel ready. There's still debate about whether your father's training methods were appropriate." Sophie smiled. "There always will be. Some people think he was brilliant. Others think he was reckless. I think he was a father who saw his daughter's potential and refused to let convention limit it. Was it perfect? No. But it gave me skills that saved lives and a career I love. I can live with that ambiguity." What would you say to parents who have children with extraordinary abilities? Sophie thought carefully. I'd say, nurture it, but don't exploit it. Challenge them, but don't endanger them. Believe in their capacity, but don't burden them with expectations they can't meet. My father walked that line, not perfectly, but well enough. Every child is different. Every situation is unique. There's no universal answer. And what about the people who say children should never be in situations that require adult responsibility? I'd say, sometimes life doesn't care about should. Sometimes situations happen, And you deal with them using whatever tools you have. I didn't choose to be on Flight 1134 that day. But I was there, and I had skills that could help. Should an 11-year-old have to land a commercial jet? Of course not. But should an 11-year-old who can land a jet refuse to do so because it's not age-appropriate? I don't think so. She paused, then added, the most important lesson from that day isn't about my age. It's about the difference between can and should. Lots of people focus on whether I should have been trained to fly. But the reality is, I could. And when it mattered, that made all the difference. Later that day, Sophie flew the hypersonic aircraft to Mach 6, pushing the boundaries of what was possible, just like her father had taught her. And somewhere in Portland, Jack Mitchell watched the telemetry on his screen, proud beyond words of the daughter who'd proven that competence has no age limit, that talent, properly nurtured and professionally trained, can exist in unexpected packages. The debate would continue forever. Was it right? Was it wrong? Was it inspiration or exploitation? But for the 198 people who walked off Southwest Flight 1134 alive, there was only one truth that mattered. Sophie Mitchell knew how to fly. And sometimes, that's enough.